What if Vikings colonized America? How the world would change. Picture a stony northern shore under a cold dawn. Sea mist lifts. A longship creaks against a wooden pier. Above it stands a timber palisade with carved dragon heads, a cross set beside a runestone, and smoke curling from turf roof houses. Children chase each other between racks of drying fish. At the gate, a Norse trader hands a sharpened iron axe to a man in a spruce cloak sewn with shells. They nod. Two worlds, meeting as neighbors instead of rumors. If this outpost didn't vanish, if it grew, how far would the ripples travel? Let's set our anchor in real history before we loose the lines into speculation. Around the year 1000, Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, sailed from Greenland and touched North American shores. The sagas call it Vinland, the land of wild grapes and good timber. At Lonso Meadows, on the tip of Newfoundland, archaeologists found the remains of a Norse settlement, iron nails forged from bog ore, halls built in familiar Icelandic style. Thorfinn Karlsefni tried to plant a colony. They traded with the indigenous peoples, described in the sagas as Skraelings. They also fought with them. Supplies were thin. Greenland was fragile. Europe wasn't looking west yet. The climate turned colder. The outpost faded, and with it, a chapter that could have rewritten everything. But what if one turning point turned the other way? Imagine the Norse push one sail further south, past the perilous Labrador, into the mouth of a vast river, sheltered and rich. They find a fjord-like bay off the Gulf of St. Lawrence, where bog iron and timber lie abundant, where salmon crowd rivers, where friendlier contact with Mi'kmaq traders opens doors instead of closing them. The Norse build a Nar harbor. They set posts, raise walls, and name it Straumsfjord, the Bay of Currents. In our timeline, they went home. In this one, they stay. The first phase, the foothold, looks modest. A cluster of halls, a forge stoked day and night to pull metal from bog iron, turning river mud into knives and nails. An orchard planted with seeds tucked in linen from Norway. A little stave church with a wooden Christ carved by a Greenland hand. And along the riverbank, a market where amber beads and fine wool are traded for pelts, carved pipes and baskets so tightly woven they hold water. The spoken words are few at first, and they're awkward, but hands and smiles carry the meaning. An alliance takes shape, not perfect, not without friction, but enough to share warning fires against raiders and watch the river for each other. Seasons pass. Ships keep arriving. The Greenland colony, always hungry for wood and iron, now has a lifeline. In Norway, kings who once barely tolerated the far-off saga of Vinland now count its furs and timber in their ledgers. Priests mark it in their letters. A bishop in Nidaros hears of souls to be shepherded in the west. In Bergen, a Hanseatic merchant tastes dried cod from the far side of the sea and sees profit. By 1120, the Norse have learned local ways. They leave the open ocean in winter and travel river networks in birch bark canoes. They build houses that breathe in the cold, copying the turf and timber style of both worlds. A few marriages cross the palisade. Children grow up switching between words and songs. They learn to read runes and river tracks in the same day. And in spring, when the ice breaks, sails bloom like white flowers and carry crates eastward. Beaver, fox, marten furs for the chilly courts of Europe. Timber for shipyards hungry for masts. History bends here in small, steady increments. Not a conquest, not a flag planted in blood. More like a root threading its way into new soil. Over decades, a Norse-Indigenous frontier culture emerges on the St. Lawrence. It knows how to smith iron and how to navigate rapids. It keeps a calendar of feasts with both saints and seasons. The sagas start to include places with new names: Straumsfjord, Hop, and a long river that becomes the spine of stories. Now, what changes first? Disease? We have to tread carefully here. This was a catastrophe in our timeline, a shattering loss for indigenous nations after 1492. In this alternate path, contact begins centuries earlier and stays thin for a long time. Epidemics thrive on density. Small crews, sporadic ships, and small trading posts may mean fewer explosive outbreaks. That could turn the worst single-century collapse into waves spread over time, still tragic, still painful, but with more space for adaptation, healing, and resistance. It's not a miracle cure. It's a different tempo. And that tempo matters. Meanwhile, technology moves both ways. Iron knives and adzes change how wood is worked. Canoe design transforms how the Norse move inland. From Iroquoian farmers to Algonquian hunters, communities begin using metal tools in daily life by the 1100s and 1200s, not the 1500s. Trade trails thicken. Wampum belts record treaties that now include pale-haired traders from the sea. Somewhere upriver, a smith sets up a small bloomery by a village, and iron trickles into the hands of people who aren't rebuilding Europe's cathedrals but carving their own worlds. And the horse, does it cross early? The Norse sailed sheep, cattle, and horses to Iceland and Greenland. It's brutal on animals, and many die. But with Straumsfjord thriving and supplies reliable, a handful survive the passage by the late 1100s. At first, they're curiosities. Then they're useful. By 1250, horses have moved beyond the Norse palisade, traded to neighbors, given as gifts for alliance, stolen in the night and tamed at dawn. Hooves drum across eastern trails. Over generations, that pulse travels west, long before settlers from Europe ever see a Chesapeake sunrise. The Great Plains are still far away, but by the 1300s, prairies will hear thunder. Imagine how that shifts power among nations centuries earlier, how hunts, warfare, and diplomacy all recalibrate. Now turn the map back to the North Atlantic. Europe notices, not instantly and not with empires, but notice it does. By the 1200s, Portolan charts whisper of Winlandia beyond Iceland and Greenland. The Hanseatic League smells profit in fur and fish. Bergen becomes an Atlantic nodal port. Norwegian kings send a sheriff to formalize things at Straumsfjord, and a bishop sails west to bless a church with a roof that's half Nordic, half river-woven art. The papacy, curious and opportunistic, grants a diocese on the edge of the world. Cahokia, the great city on the Mississippi, hits its peak around this time in our timeline. In this alternate one, if iron tools trickle into the eastern woodlands and inland networks, the timing syncs differently. New tools and the first whispers of horses could amplify some chiefdoms and destabilize others. Cahokia's mound builders may get an unexpected second wind, or new rivals armed with better blades. Diplomacy, ritual, and trade all dance to a slightly different beat. Then the weather shifts. The Little Ice Age cools the North Atlantic in the 1300s. Greenland suffers. In our history, it collapses. But now Vinland is no myth. It's a pantry and a partner. Straumsfjord feeds Greenland timber and grain. In return, Greenlanders fish and hunt and ferry the mail of a civilization stretched thin by ice. The colony hangs on. It shrinks perhaps, but it doesn't vanish. And what of Europe's worst guest, plague? The Black Death still rips through in the mid-1300s. Vinland cannot stop it. But the existence of a western frontier matters. A battered Norwegian or Danish crown sees a realm that includes a western outpost that did not share the same crowded ports. Some ships are quarantined. Others sail where news is slow. Letters reach Straumsfjord months late. The grief crosses the water, but more diffusely. The western colony becomes a place of refuge for a few. Cousins fleeing famine, a monk carrying rare books to copy, merchants seeking markets not broken by fear. What about the old world's table? Could transatlantic foods arrive early? Potatoes from the Andes would almost certainly remain unknown for now. Our Norse haven't reached that far south. But maize, corn, had already traveled into parts of the eastern woodlands by the time Cahokia rose. That puts it within reach. Imagine sacks of dry yellow kernels sailing to Galicia or Sicily in the 1200s or 1300s. Farmers are suspicious, as farmers often are, but tether a few goats to a new crop during a lean year, and opinions change. If maize reaches Mediterranean hills a century or two earlier, Europe's population curve might lift slightly before the plague batters it down. After the plague, that faster staple advantage helps recovery. By the 1400s, this slow-burning Atlantic world is a distinct space. Vinland is culturally Norse and deeply local. Knit to indigenous nations by marriage, trade, and treaty. The law looks like Norway written with river ink. They count years by both feasts of saints and the return of salmon runs. The sagas turn into ledgers and land charters. Children learn to read runes and scratch prayers in Latin, then paddle to set nets under a sky full of geese. Now we hit the hinge everyone knows, 1492, and the Iberian gamble. When Columbus sails, he doesn't bump into a world unprepared. His ships, battered, tacked north in a storm and put into Straumsfjord for repairs, because the rumor of a safe harbor with iron nails is already a thing in Portuguese taverns. He finds a working port. A priest welcomes him in a language that sounds like Norway, but feels like the river. There's a bishop's seal, a sheriff's mark, a market with beaver pelts and iron spearheads. And outside the gate, a Mi'kmaq elder smiles with a joke spread across 3 languages. The discovery is not a discovery, it's a diplomatic incident. Spain appeals to Rome. Portugal shouts about spheres. Norway, and by now the Kalmar Union's Scandinavian crown, arrives with seals and saints and says, "This is ours," and also, "It isn't just ours." Because treaties have been signed with people who never kissed a pope's ring, the papacy frowns, does its math, and scribbles a new line in the Atlantic, not just between Spain and Portugal, but with a separate northern claim. Think a tripartite treaty of Tordesillas. The South and the Caribbean tilt toward Iberia. The far north and the cold coasts stay Scandinavian in name. In between lies a contested wilderness of maps and ambition. As the 1500s roll on, something else ignites. Reformation. Lutheran winds blow across Denmark-Norway. Vinland feels them too. Some parishes swap saints for psalms. Others stay Catholic. The colony splits along a line that in Europe sparks war. In Vinland, it sparks town meetings in smoky halls, with elders from both sides and indigenous allies who care less about Rome or Wittenberg and more about who honors which treaty. Refugees from European confessional wars start trickling not just to England's colonies, still tiny, still late, but to Straumsfjord and its daughter towns up the St. Lawrence, where the talk is in 3 languages and a 4th is being invented in the schoolyard. The French peer upriver and frown, the English eye the coast, but it's not empty. A northern seaboard with knitted Norse-Indigenous communities doesn't welcome newcomers as free land. It hires them, it taxes them. Sometimes it repels them, sometimes it makes deals. Champlain's dreams alter. Jamestown arrives to negotiate from day one, not to plant in a vacuum. And to the south, Spain has its own plate full, carving a silver road from the Andes to Seville, and glancing north with less energy and fewer excuses when the Pope's lines argue otherwise. Mid-century wars come, because they always do, but they look different. Instead of a 7 years war led by France and Britain over a continent full of peoples rather than empires, we get a series of northern wars that include a Lutheran Vinland, a Catholic rump in the same valley, indigenous confederacies that have had horses and iron for 2 centuries, and Dutch merchants who show up everywhere trade smells sweet. The Iroquois League still forms, still negotiates smartly and fights fiercely, but now it's negotiating with a neighbor who knows its strength, and a neighbor who has been kin by marriage for generations. Alliances aren't perfect, wrongs are still done, but the balance looks less like sudden overwhelming force and more like a complicated shifting web. By 1600, the horse culture of the plains has fully blossomed, not because of Spanish shocks from the south, but because of a slow wave from the north and east. Comanche, Lakota, Cheyenne, names that will matter, meet the horse earlier. That changes the buffalo hunt. It changes warfare. It changes trade routes that carry not just hides, but news. The metal axe and the gun arrive earlier too, but not the same guns. Scandinavia sells matchlocks and wheel locks when it can, but so can the Dutch and English. Indigenous gunsmithing appears sooner in a world where iron came centuries earlier. The power equation is fluid. No one writes treaties alone. What happens to slavery in this world? The Norse took slaves in medieval times, a grim reality, and Europe's appetite for coerced labor didn't disappear. But the northern climate and the economic base, furs, timber, fish, never required the sugar plantation scale that drove the transatlantic African slave trade in the Caribbean and Brazil. Iberian colonies still build those brutal engines in the south. In the north, coerced labor exists in pockets, but there's more bargaining and less plantation logic. A darker branch of history doesn't vanish. It just twists to a different shape and scale in this region. By the 1700s, an Atlantic world with a Scandinavian axis looks familiar and strange. There's a printing press in Stromsfjord cranking out broadsheets in a script that once traced dragon heads and now announces grain prices and council elections. There are schools where a child might read a hymn in Danish, a letter in Latin, a story in a local tongue, and a treaty that requires all three to be binding. There are names, Elling, Leif, Aki, that sit next to names that sing a different music. A Norse Algonquian dialect becomes a language in its own right. Churches echo with psalms and drum beats on feast days, and news from Europe is news, not fate. By the time a British Empire rises in our world, it hits a different puzzle here. The best harbors on the northern coast are already taken. The timber trade is locked by Hanseatic descendant firms with deep ties to river towns. The French don't get to call the St. Lawrence by themselves. There's no blank slate for a Boston or a New York to dominate. The English go south, pushing harder into the mid-Atlantic, negotiating more, fighting more, and sometimes turning merchant rather than empire. The Dutch wedge in wherever they can. The map stays checkered longer. What about the big engines of modernity, science and industry? Earlier maize perhaps softens famines in parts of Europe, giving a slightly fuller belly to later centuries. The South still fuels global sugar and silver. The North supplies ships and fish. The Industrial Revolution likely still ignites in Britain for reasons beyond empire: coal, wages, institutions. But its reach into North America faces a well-entrenched northern competitor, a Vinlandic federation with its own shipyards, ironworks, and legal traditions, deeply intertwined with indigenous nations whose sovereignty is old and written. At this point, the modern world's outlines are familiar enough to see, but the details on the map shimmer. Do we get a United States as we know it? Maybe a looser set of Atlantic polities instead. A Scandinavian-led Vinlandic Commonwealth along the St. Lawrence and Newfoundland. A Dutch-English quilt along the mid-Atlantic. Iberian might strong in the Caribbean and Mexico. And powerful indigenous confederacies at the table, speaking as nations because they've always been treated as such in the North. Borders shift, flags change. But the idea that the New World began with a blank page never takes hold. It never could. Here's where I want to pause and ask you something. If contact had started earlier and slower, would the demographic catastrophe we call the Great Dying have softened, or just stretched out with the same pain? Tell me how you see it, and if you're enjoying this alternate voyage, tap like and subscribe so we can keep running the clock in unexpected directions together. So, could a Norse foothold have truly lasted? The skeptics will point to weather and distance, to models that show how hard it is to support a colony across that harsh sea. They're right, but this scenario isn't magic. It rests on two realistic tweaks: better geography, a sheltered, resource-rich bay, and better relationships, alliances built on trade and respect rather than raids. The Norse did both elsewhere. Greenland survived centuries on thinner soil and colder wind than Newfoundland. Hanseatic merchants ran longer, riskier routes for profit. And indigenous nations were absolute masters of these landscapes, with knowledge and networks that turned strangers into partners when given the chance. With those pieces, a small settlement could become a society. And if it did, then the shock of 1492 becomes less a collision and more a meeting of old neighbors. The papacy shares lines. The Reformation crosses the ocean and finds people already arguing at town councils. Horses and iron arrive early, spreading power in patterns we don't recognize. Maize fills bellies while the plague still stalks. Greenland survives as a leaf on a resilient branch. The St. Lawrence becomes the Nile of the North, with a culture that wears carved crosses and woven river signs on the same day. Of course, not all changes are gentle. There are wars here too, and betrayals. Guns don't vanish. Gold still glitters in the south. Greed still crosses oceans faster than compassion. But the story that so often begins with emptiness and arrival is replaced by a different story: endurance and entanglement. An Atlantic where frontiers speak more than one language, and remember treaties that actually had time to mature. And that's the heart of why this what-if matters. History isn't just great men and sharp dates. It's choices made at harbors and hearths, alliances at riverbanks, and the difference between a friendly trade and a deadly insult. A slightly warmer inlet, a leader who chooses a gift over a raid, a bishop who sends a patient priest instead of a zealot, a Haida canoe meeting a Norse nar in a fog bank and deciding to share a fire. These are small things, but small things, repeated, become a world. So if Vikings colonized America, the world wouldn't just be a different map, it would be a different memory. A memory where the northern Atlantic is a neighborhood, where the word new is always followed by old names spoken with new accents. And maybe, just maybe, the great tragedies of contact would still hurt, but they would have had more time to be answered by resilience, wisdom, and the stubborn human habit of learning to live together. History is fragile. It takes only a harbor, a treaty, a winter that isn't quite as cold to tip the scales. If a single palisade on a foggy bay had held, our atlases and our stories about who arrived, who stayed, and who shaped the future would be rewritten. And that's a question worth sailing for, every time.